Welcome back to another episode of our Six Questions podcast. I'm Trent England for Save Our States. Very glad to be joined by someone we've wanted to have on the program for a while. He is Ryan Haynie. He's an attorney in Oklahoma City. He is the Criminal Justice Reform Fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, which is where Save Our States happens to have an office, and I'm also a fellow there at OCPA. So glad to be a colleague of Ryan's and to talk with him today about some of the things that he's been working on, not just in Oklahoma, but all around the country with regards to criminal justice reform and big tech. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about the Electoral College as well. Ryan, welcome to Six Questions.
Oh, thanks for having me, Trent. And I am, someone who followed OCPA's work and the work that you were doing before I was hired on. It's an honor to be your colleague as well.
Well, thank you. And I should mention to people two other things. One is you are coming to us from Utah, so we've got
Beautiful
another.
Park City.
Yeah, from Park City. I mean, well, I wasn't going to give you away on that. Although I know you're working. I know you're at a conference, but yeah, beautiful Park City. So thanks for being flexible with us that way. And you're the host of a podcast, all separately from this, Thinking on Lincoln. We had your co-host Curtis Shelton on a few episodes back, but Ryan, real quick before we get into our six questions, tell people what Thinking on Lincoln is about.
Yeah, well, we are a podcast focused on primarily local Oklahoma governmental issues. So the name Thinking on Lincoln, I think people sometimes think it has something to do with Abraham Lincoln. It's not. It's our both the OCPA office and the state capitol are both on Lincoln Boulevard. And so the idea is we're coming to you from Lincoln Boulevard, talking to you about what's going on 10 blocks to the north at the Oklahoma State Capitol for the most part. We dive into a bunch of different issues, but for the most part, most of the time, we are at least trying to focus on Oklahoma issues. Even when we have on, like an AEI scholar on housing, we really try to get them to focus on, okay, but what does your research on what's going on nationally, how does that affect what our people here in the great state of Oklahoma are seeing on the ground here. So
very good. Yeah, people. I mean, it's worth anybody listening to, but I think particularly for folks in Oklahoma or just sort of more generally in quote unquote flyover country to get that perspective on like you said, what is public policy doing to people who live in places like Oklahoma and Kansas, Missouri. Well, let's dive into the six questions here, talking with Ryan Haynie from OCPA. The first question, Ryan, you are the Criminal Justice Reform Fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Why should conservatives, libertarians, people on the right care about criminal justice reform?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, and we can just start with the one that almost becomes a default and almost like a token reason, which is sort of the fiscal issue. But I don't want to focus on that. Certainly, there is a sense in which there's a feeling on the right that we are spending too much money on incarceration, particularly in states in Oklahoma where we tend to be in the cellar as far as incarcerators throughout the country, which given the United States' position amongst the world makes us one of the most carceral states in the world. So that is certainly one part of it. But I think even more fundamental, at least for me, is this idea of limiting government. I think conservatives can have blind spots when it comes to law enforcement, particularly when we talk about prosecutors. I mean, certainly with police as well. But I think it's important for conservatives to remember that these people are government actors, right? And so they are necessary, indispensable government actors. I mean, I'm a believer in, I love the Declaration, and I believe in our rights of life, liberty, and property, or the pursuit of happiness, however you want to say it. And police and prosecutors, judges, and all these government actors, without them doing their job, there is no life, liberty, or property, right? I mean, they protect that. But at the same time, I think it's also important to balance that with making sure that we are sort of limiting the scope of what they can do, making sure that we protect the due process rights of people who are caught up in the criminal justice system. I mean, we have to remember that these people are in the crosshairs of the state, and all of the resources that the state can bring to bear against them. So, when I started law school in 2013, I frankly thought I would probably go and be a prosecutor. And then somewhere during my second or third year, I had a mindset shift where this idea of limited government and protecting constitutional rights kind of trumped that law and order side. Again, I still think law and order is important, but I started to see the way the government sometimes operated. I mean, we highlight issues with the DOJ and the way they argue cases and some of the lack of accountability that's there, and that spoke to me as a conservative. I love the Constitution. I think it's important for people to remember that of the Bill of Rights, 4 of the 10 original amendments, that make up the Bill of Rights, deal almost exclusively with rights of the criminally accused.
Yeah.
And you could probably make arguments that there are others. Especially if you consider at the time of the founding, seditious libel was a crime. I mean, arguably the First Amendment is like it deals with the rights of the criminally accused. So, that was something that was really important to me. And I found, my first job out of law school was doing criminal defense work. And I found that to be very, it gave me some personal satisfaction that I don't think I would have received working as sort of like an arm of the state.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that for a lot of conservatives, it's become popular to say, and I think I think certainly not incorrect to say that the FBI has been politicized.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to me because uh, I was writing on these topics, almost 20 years ago now, and that was part of the concern back then. And yet, it tends, and I don't think this is unique to conservatives. I think this is just a sort of a people outside of the system tend to look at it all in terms of sort of good people, bad people, people we like, people we don't like. And so if a politician you like is being, the FBI is going after that politician, well, then the FBI must be politicized. And people miss the fact that they're just using the same tools, the same attitude, posture, the same power that they've had for decades. And nothing really has changed just because the target has changed. Nothing fundamental. So,
Right.
yeah, I really value the work that you do, Ryan, and just other folks who work on these topics that as I say, I used to work on a long time ago, and don't really do that much on it anymore. But I think it is the American founders were the original American criminal justice reformers, and so anybody working on these issues is really standing on their shoulders.
Yeah,
Uh,
I agree.
the second question is kind of drilling down on this. With Oklahoma in particular, you mentioned, states like Oklahoma being some of the leading incarcerators in the country. How is criminal justice reform going in Oklahoma?
Sure. Well, let me first start off by framing that a little bit, because I think sometimes when people hear, "Oh, well, we're one of the top incarcerators in the country," it raises the question, well, where should we be, right? Because we've got a governor that says he wants to make us a top 10 state. I've got coalition partners on the left who talk about getting to sort of the average, right? So trying to be, instead of 48th or 50th, how do we get to 25, 26? Now, my personal opinion is that a state's incarceration rate should probably track its violent crime rate. So, we keep track of violent crime rates and nonviolent crime rates, and it's not to say that you should never go to prison for a nonviolent crime. But if those two data points, are here and here, then your incarceration rate, in my mind, should be somewhere in between those, but closer to your violent crime rate. So I tell lawmakers all the time, I'm not trying to get us to top 10 right now, right? Like I want to get us in line with where we are with respect to our violent crime rate, because there is a huge disconnect. I mean, um, and the numbers shift, and that makes, having moving targets makes it difficult. But we tend to hover around the low 20s in violent crime. We tend to be worse on nonviolent crime. So, I'm not trying to get us top 10. I'm really not even trying to get us to average. I just want to get us closer to that. And so, we've been trying to accomplish that in a number of different ways since I've been at OCPA, the first of which was a state ballot initiative that would have cut down on the state's ability to use what we call sentence enhancements for people who have committed a prior offense. There, without getting too in the weeds of that, we had all the exceptions that you would want to have in something like that. So if somebody had committed a violent crime in the past, then they could still have their sentence enhanced because of that prior offense. But what we wanted to stop happening is using, former nonviolent offenses that frankly are either have nothing to do with the current offense that someone is charged with, from taking that range from, and I'll just give you a great the example that I always remember is second degree burglary, which in Oklahoma means you broke into a house while no one was there. I think it could even be like a garage or like a shed or something. Um, it's 0 to 7 years on a first offense. But if you have a prior felony conviction, it gets enhanced. And now it's got a mandatory minimum of 2 years, and the maximum is now life. And so the question is, well, does anybody get life? I mean, occasionally, yes. It's rare, but even still, one of the things we want to do is try to make sure that two people who have maybe identical criminal backgrounds and they commit identical crimes, one person gets leniency in one county and another person gets the book thrown at them in another county, right? And that's what our governor sees all the time in applications for parole, applications for pardons, and so commutations. And so that's something that we've tried to fix on the back end, and that's great. But looking for ways that we can fix things on the front end, and that proposition failed. I think in part because it was an amendment to the state constitution. I actually think in large part because it was an amendment to the state constitution. And there is a hesitancy in Oklahoma to meddle with the Constitution. And so I think that was probably a miscalculation by the crafters of that initiative. But it's led into a number of other legislative battles trying to classify our felony system. Right now, we don't have, in some states, you might have a Class A felony, a Class B felony, and they have sort of uniform ranges of punishment. And we don't have that in Oklahoma. Every offense is in its own part of the code, and it has its own range. And sometimes they make sense, and sometimes they don't make sense. So trying to kind of bring that together in a coherent way where like crimes are treated like other like crimes. That's something that we've been trying to work on now for really since I've been at OCPA, which I started in June of 2020. But we have had some legislative victories. This past year, a bill that I was very proud of, I helped draft it. It was a clean slate expungement bill. So thinking sort of tangentially about the criminal justice system, how do we make sure that people are able to move on once they've paid their debt to society and get jobs? And we have this great, in my mind, a great statutory scheme rather for expungements, but they're expensive. So we're actually willing as a state to expunge quite a few records, but it's going to cost you, as much as, or maybe on average, about $2,500 per offense to go through and get all those expunged so that your record looks clean for educational purposes, for housing purposes, or
And that's, I mean, you're talking about a process that involves people completely paying their debt to society and and staying clean for extended period of time and all of this, and then they jump through every one of those hoops. They're not, they haven't committed more crimes. They fully
right,
pay their debt to society, and then they get to a point where the law says, well, now at this point, because you've done all these things and because now we really believe in your ability to fully reintegrate with society, we're going to legally allow you to expunge your record, but you have to pay a whole bunch of fees and court costs to do that, and just removing, not changing anything about the process other than making it so that it's not a situation where rich people can get their crimes expunged but poor
yes,
people can't. I
that's
mean, a lot of
exactly
that,
right.
Ryan, it strikes me that a lot of what you're talking about really is just sort of bringing our system in line with the fundamental idea of the rule of law, and that people are being treated the same, whether it's in punishments or whether it's in the expungement process, that we don't have a system where people in one county get treated much worse than people in another county, or rich people get treated much better than poor people. I mean, is this all just sort of really based on the idea of the rule of law?
I think so. And another issue that has gotten a bad rap because some states have done it really poorly is bail reform, right? I mean, bail reform works the same way. I mean, if bail is available to two people, let's say that they commit the same crime and bail is available, but one person is sitting in prison, has not been convicted of a crime yet, they're like still presumed innocent, but somebody else who has money, their parents have money, they're able to go and raise it from friends or family or whatever, can get out. That person's able to better help their attorney collect evidence in defense of their case, um, to continue working so that they can afford an attorney, and still be sort of like a net benefit to society. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
I think that's
avoid
exactly right. I think
avoid
rule
all
of law
the
is a big part of all of this.
Yeah, they can avoid all the mental health risks that go with spending extended time in county jails, which
Right.
oftentimes are not uh, much worse than places than the prisons. I just think this is fascinating. I think a lot of people don't know this. A lot of people in jail haven't been convicted of the crime. They're awaiting their trial or plea bargaining or whatever. Versus prisons, where everybody who's in a prison has been convicted of a crime, and mostly of a somewhat, what we consider a somewhat serious crime if
Sure.
they're going to prison. And yet prisons are much nicer places than jails, by and large. So I mean, would you agree with that, Ryan?
I think, yeah, I think so. And part of it is because, jails are almost used as, um, now that we don't have like mental health facilities where we can take somebody and maybe involuntarily commit them to get them some help, whether that means help with a substance abuse issue or mental health issues. But those people are largely being housed in jails. And so, I serve on a citizens advisory board for our local jail trust. And, one of the problems that the local jail has that I don't know that you would find at many prisons is like they're just littered with bed bugs. In some of these floors, they don't turn the lights off at night. People sleep with the lights on because the bed bugs are so much worse when the lights go out. But of course, the reason the bed bug problem is a problem is because a lot of what they're doing is just housing homeless people there who probably need more services rather than just being detained somewhere.
Yeah. Well, let's shift to a topic that might seem completely different, but I think ties in with criminal justice reform and trying to implement conservative policy solutions in ways that reduce some of the disparities between rich and poor, or between people who live in one zip code and people who live in another zip code, and that's school choice. I know, Ryan, you're very involved with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs in advancing school choice policies. Why does that matter in a state like Oklahoma, especially where a lot of people people might be listening to this in California or in New York or some of these blue states and say, well, sure, our states have all these problems in education, wokeness, schools that aren't safe, but surely in red Oklahoma, the schools are still teaching mom and apple pie and patriotism and are still relatively safe. So why would a place like Oklahoma need school choice?
Well, I mean, it's very similar, like you said, it's very similar to the criminal justice issue. Oklahoma ranks very poorly in with respect to academic outcomes, and so I had a conversation with a legislator once who, he represents a rural district, and he goes, well, we're not hanging the rainbow flag, and we're not doing the CRT and teaching some of these wacky concepts. And I didn't say this to him because it's kind of like telling this kid is ugly, but it's like, well, sure, representative, but they can't read and they can't do math, and that's also very problematic. And I had lunch and I was sitting next to a guy from Apple, and we were talking about what it is that drives Apple to, they're not hiring in California anymore. They have reached the limit of what they can afford in California as far as employees. So now they're looking at Texas and Florida and most recently North Carolina. And one of the reasons I was like, why North Carolina? Well, you've got UNC, Chapel Hill, Wake Forest, and Duke, all with that triangle. I think they call it like
The
Tobacco
research
Road or like.
triangle, yeah.
And he's like, that research triangle is huge, and so if Oklahoma wants to be competitive in the in bringing in employers who are going to hire bring in well-paying jobs like in engineering and in the STEM fields, it's you've got to have an education system that can support that. And so obviously higher ed is a big part of that, but your higher ed is oftentimes only going to be as good as the K-12 system, right? So if the K-12 system in Oklahoma is not, which right now it's not, is not producing students who can be successful in those fields, a lot of the kids, even the ones that get into college, are having to take remedial math classes at these colleges, and that is just not going to cut it in a competitive workforce in the future. And so it's in my mind, it's very important for the future of our state that we turn, that we write the course with respect to education. And that means all kinds of things, right? It means the worldview issues that we talk about with respect to, CRT or gender affirming care and whether or not we let, boys into girls' bathrooms and that sort of thing. Like that certainly plays a role, of course. But also we got to make sure that we're teaching them to read and to do math. So that,
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, on the sleeve unpatriotic to teach 16, out of the 1619 project curriculum or CRT, which is fundamentally racist, right? That's unpatriotic. But to accept that young Americans in Oklahoma or anywhere else, in Chicago, are not going to learn to effectively read and write and do math is also profoundly unpatriotic. It's anti-American not to teach young Americans to be successful. And I think that's what people in states like Oklahoma, and I moved here from another part of the country where, there's all kinds of crazy wokeness, which is terrible, but the educational standards are higher.
yeah,
The public schools, the standards that they hold themselves to are higher. It has nothing to do with money. It has to do with culture and self-respect. No, I think if we could ever recharacterize things in that way, where people understood how unpatriotic, how anti-American it is, how we're serving Chinese Communist Party interests when we fail to teach students in Oklahoma City to read and write, maybe we could shake things up. And certainly seems like school choice is one of the quicker paths to at least allowing a lot more students to have a lot more success than we're getting right now.
agreed. And I will also just say, I mean, I think it's a both and approach. It's the academic side, and there certainly is, I think, a anti-intellectual. Um, there is sort of a thread running through, I think, the state in certain parts of the state. It's like, people people with degrees or with advanced degrees are almost met with even more skepticism. And certainly, part of that is like, whether you want to call it like the coastal elite ruling class or whatever, has brought that upon itself, right? I mean, we saw that with COVID. Um, but in addition to that, you know, by giving parents choices, educational choices, we can stop playing political whack-a-mole with, 2 years ago was CRT. This last year it was, transgender bathroom issues. And regardless of what you think about that, right? I mean, parents should be able to make that choice for themselves, whether they want their kid to go to a school that is gender affirming or is like more, what I would call based in like in reality, right? And it looks like,
Yeah.
the next fight is going to be over pornographic books. And so who knows what the fight is going to be after that? I mean, it just keeps getting wackier and wackier. And rather than continuing to play political whack-a-mole and just like, always being one step behind the local superintendent or school board, we can just get out ahead of it and say, we're just going to give everybody an option. And if you want your kid to go to the local indoctrination center, then that's perfectly fine with us. But we're going to give other kids an out.
Yeah, yeah, which blows some people's minds because some people, and I think some people even on the right, you sort of discover, oh no, you're a totalitarian, just like people on the left. You're just out of power because you'll hear people say, well, but there are some schools on the right that, or there's some schools that you would have under school choice would be bad. And so we've got to create an educational utopia, which means we need a monopoly system that we control versus a monopoly system that somebody else controls. You say, okay, like, so you're just like the NEA, you're just like Joe Biden, like you want a top-down system. You just think that you're better than they are. Like I actually find that part of this debate very very helpful, very clarifying.
Yeah.
Ryan, let's jump over to another topic, and that is something I know you've been thinking about lately. The whole question of big tech, which is driving a lot of this wokeness, which is, I mean, is something that seems very new under the sun, just in terms of having these big private corporations that have a tremendous amount of power over the virtual public square. Ryan, what are you thinking about in terms of what we need to do, what we need not to do when it comes to protecting our country from some of the downsides of this technology or these big companies?
Sure. So one of the things that I'm kind of excited about is well, let me back up just a little bit. So, at OCPA, our four core principles are limited government, free enterprise, personal responsibility, and individual initiative. And that free enterprise means a lot to me because I believe that free people require free markets. Um, and um, and so I'm very hesitant to go into the private sphere and tell people what they can or cannot do, especially when we get into issues like content moderation, right? And or like Section 230 or whatever you want. Like a lot of that stuff is actually a First Amendment issue, right? And so I think that's important to remember. But one of the things I am kind of excited about, as far as giving people or people who are frustrated with big tech, which is kind of a misnomer. Um, I think one of the things we can all agree on is that whenever the government is getting in bed with big tech and basically telling some of these tech companies to do their bidding, that is problematic. And it does look like Congress is going to shift in the midterms. And so there's an interesting piece of ALEC model legislation that where the states can pass these resolutions encouraging Congress to investigate some of these areas where like the Biden administration may have, reached out to Twitter and said, hey, we want you to, sort of like use the power of government to say like, we need you to crack down on what we think is misinformation. Like that is super problematic. And I think everybody agrees on that. I certainly do. Where I'm a little wary of some of the other things that I see coming out of conservative and sort of populist spheres is this idea that we need to, quote, crack down on big tech. I mean, the reality is, if you look at all these companies, it's not like big banking where all the banks are doing essentially the same thing, or big oil and gas where these companies are all basically just, exploring for natural, natural resources and then refining it, selling it. I mean, what Facebook and Twitter do are totally different than what Amazon does, which is totally different than what Microsoft does, right? Which is totally different than what Uber does. And so it's like, at some level, big tech is a bit of a misnomer, because it's like, yes, they're technology companies, but they're not all doing the same thing. And I think when it comes down to it, I think what people are really frustrated at is Facebook, Twitter, and Google. And a lot of that just stems from Twitter and Facebook booting Trump off their platforms, which I don't think they should have done. But Trump's now got his own platform. I think it's called Truth Social. I'm just going to tell you, like, if you say something bad about Trump or his family on Truth Social, they boot you off. And so, if I just think conservatives need to be aware that any growth of government power used to rein in or break up or whatever you want to call it to big tech can be used against them as well. And that's why fundamentally I'm always skeptical about sort of these power grabs by the right, because my fear is always, well, what happens when you lose the next election and then those power grabs are sort of used back against you with equal or greater force. So that's kind of the broad strokes of what I'm looking at and what I've been thinking about. I'd love to see Congress do something on data privacy so that we have a very uniform, single data privacy solution for everyone across state boundaries. I don't like to see states doing it on a state by state patchwork basis, but data privacy is a big deal that hopefully Congress can get its act together and pass something on.
Well, fingers crossed for Congress to get its act together, I guess. But no, I think that that's an area where actually there's a lot of seems like there's interesting kind of left right agreement as you get out to the the extremes, not in a pejorative sense, but just people who are further left, people who are further right. I think sometimes agree on solutions, and then people who are sort of closer to the center left, center right agree on solutions. An interesting area where I think things actually could happen in Congress to craft something on data privacy that would give people a better sense of what those rules are, and the companies and everybody. Which, yeah, I think at this point, even a lot of the companies would rather see that done, because they do get worried about the sort of patchwork of different sets of rules for companies that are inherently national and global. That's really interesting, Ryan. Thanks for talking us through that. And I will say, for people who disagree, I think we're going to have a guest on who kind of takes a little bit of a more aggressive stance on big tech pretty soon. So we'll cover that angle as well. But Ryan, really glad to get your views. I have to ask you a question about the Electoral College. You've already mentioned your own fidelity to the Constitution and to those principles. Ryan, why is the Electoral College important to you when it comes to our constitutional system?
Well, I would probably tend to agree with a lot of what of the things that you all are out there saying. I watched the documentary film that you all put together. I think for me the big part is just making sure that you sort of get you get I think a better cross section of where the country is via the Electoral College, rather than and part of this, I know this will, to your audience it won't sound problematic, but I think there's a reasonable argument to be made that well, I'll just say I don't like the idea of these big cities controlling a national election. Now, in my mind, I think a lot of the issues around the Electoral College would become less of an issue if we just didn't have this imperial presidency, where the president is essentially can kind of do whatever they want. Congress doesn't check them. The courts very rarely check them, although that does seem to be changing a little bit with the makeup of this current Supreme Court. But yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to the idea that we want an accurate cross section of where the country is as a whole, which I think the Electoral College provides. I'm also sympathetic to the idea that the Electoral College requires a more consensus view. It tends to, although recently maybe is not a great case study, but it does seem to get you do seem to get fewer fringe candidates. You need to get candidates who can court various interests throughout the country, right? I mean, looking at rural places as well as urban areas, and so for all those reasons, I think it was a wise system and continues to serve us well.
Obviously, here at Save Our States, we agree with all of that. Ryan, our last question on our 6 questions program is always the same. Who is your favorite founding father and why?
Sure. Well, I wanted to go with like a more generic one. I was thinking James Madison because of the Federalist Papers and all of that. But I wanted to go a little more out on a limb, a little more like a deep track. And I'm going to say John Witherspoon because he was a Scottish Presbyterian. As a Reformed Protestant myself, I feel the need to go with somebody who was a Scottish Reformed minister as well as founding father. So that's my answer.
Very good. I think that's Reverend Witherspoon's first call out on our
Yes.
So
I was going to ask if I was the first one to mention him.
Absolutely. Well, Ryan Haynie, the Criminal Justice Reform Fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, also the co-host of the Thinkin' on Lincoln podcast. You can find that weekly wherever you find quality podcast programming. Ryan Haynie, thanks for being a part of our 6 Questions podcast.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Thanks to all of you for watching or listening to the program. We'll be back again next week. I think we've got a great guest lined up for that program and several more lined up in the weeks ahead, including looking at the election, both before it happens and whatever the outcomes are and how that affects the fight to defend the Electoral College. For Save Our States, I'm Trent England. Thanks for watching.